Get some business news for you now. Kate Moody's here with us in the studio. And Kate, Donald Trump, I think he called it the worst trade deal ever, didn't he? I'm talking about NAFTA. Now that's gone, and there is a new trade agreement between the US, Mexico and Canada.
Exactly. The name isn't quite so catchy. It's being referred to as the USMCA, the United States, Canada, Mexico and Canada agreement. This 11th hour deal coming after months of rocky negotiations. The deal will reduce tariffs and facilitate business across their borders. In addition to key sticking points in the auto and dairy sectors, negotiators have found a middle ground on labor and environmental rights and intellectual property protection. Donald Trump had threatened to withdraw from the deal altogether if the new terms weren't to his satisfaction, but he's now described this new agreement as a wonderful treaty, which he believes will make North America into a, quote, manufacturing powerhouse. Take a listen.
I'll tell you, it's turned out to be a very, very good deal for both, and a very, very good deal for all three. It puts us in a position that we've never been in before. It's very good when you look at the world and what the world is doing, and when you look at the unfair trade practices that countries are using against the United States. This is a terrific deal.
Now for more, let's cross to Washington, D.C. and talk to Chris Garcia, former Deputy Director of the U.S. Department of Commerce under the Trump administration, now CEO of Vicker Financial. Thanks for joining us on France 24. Tell us, what has really changed here? How different is the USMCA from NAFTA?
Sure, yeah. So the USMCA, as we've heard from analysts today, and we've heard directly from the White House, has been an expansion of U.S. entry and U.S. Entry for dairy farmers in particular into the Canadian market. We're also seeing a change in rules of origin, whereas previously under NAFTA, you had 62.5% of auto parts and automobiles had to be manufactured in North America. That's risen up to 75%. So you're going to see an incentivization. You're going to see an incentive, I should say, of auto parts and auto part manufacturers to relocate in Canada. You see increased IP protection. You see better standards for e-commerce. You see a real victory for, as I said, American workers, American labor unions. And you see also Mexican labor workers as well benefiting because of the ability to organize more freely. But you're also going to see environmental standards much higher for Mexican trucks that move into the United States, so they'll stop polluting as much. So there's something in this for everybody. And frankly, for all three parties, what I think this is a reorientation by President Trump to move manufacturing away from Southeast Asia and back into North America.
Does anyone lose out in this new deal?
Well, I mean, there are some losers and some folks within the three parties, I think, that would have liked things that were conceded. But I think if you take a look at the overall strategy, President Trump wanted to strike this deal with Canada and Mexico. I think the next move is to find common ground with the European Union, and ultimately the loser will be China if they continue with their unfair trade practices, because not only will they have to face a robust U.S. economy to compete with, where we have the upper hand, but we'll also have our allies north and south of the border in Canada and Mexico, as well as the European Union, calling them on their bad practices, their IP theft, their forced technology transfer, their currency manipulation, their tariffs, their subsidization of their steel and aluminum industries. So ultimately, the real loser will be China.
Now, farming and manufacturing are key pillars of this new deal, but there are some provisions addressing technology and intellectual property protections. Does this agreement adequately tackle 21st century problems?
I think this is as close as we're going to get for the time being. Remember that when NAFTA was first struck, we're talking the 1990s, and then signed into law by President Bush, and I'm looking at this complete picture of what this UMCA deal is going to do for IP rights, IP protection. Silicon Valley has lobbied very hard in Washington, D.C. Canadian media has lobbied very hard to keep protection of its media, its cultural protections there. And so I think that it goes very far. It's certainly much better than NAFTA was, and it brings the standards into the 21st century, whereas the previous NAFTA did not address those standards at all.
Now, Chris, there was no progress on the admittedly separate issue of steel and aluminum tariffs, and the administration does continue to impose tariffs on some of its other biggest trading partners. The Federal Reserve said last week it was hearing a growing chorus of concerns from American businesses on that subject. Do you think this strategy is possibly hurting more than helping?
Well, it's certainly not hurting more than it's helping, because we see today the fruits of that hard bargaining. You know, you in a negotiation, you have to make the other party believe that you're serious and that you'll actually follow through on the threats that you make. Otherwise, they don't take you seriously. You know, past administrations threw their hands up and they said, well, I guess things are just going to be made in China from now on. I guess, you know, manufacturing is just going to go overseas from this point forward. And so if you take a look at this case study, this is going to be written about in history books for years to come. And they're going to show, if they report facts honestly, that President Trump drove a hard bargain, fought for the American worker, which is what he promised he would do, and ultimately delivered a deal that was better for the American worker. And so where we look at these tactics, these tariff threats in the short run, they're not to be used as an end in of themselves. They're a means to an end to get parties back to the table, to inflict as much damage, if you will, as we can on them if they're not playing fair. But if they do decide to play fair, hey, zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies is the end goal.
All right, Chris Garcia, former Deputy Director of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Thanks so much for speaking to us on France 24 this evening. Let's check in on the day's trading action now. Wall Street has welcomed that new trade deal. Investors pleased that one area of uncertainty at least has now been resolved. Big manufacturers like Ford, General Motors, and Boeing all rising about 1% this hour. A mixed close for the major European markets earlier on. We saw the DAX and CAC 40 with a positive finish. Ryanair was the biggest loser of the day. Its shares dropped 12% after issuing a profit warning. Now, stocks in Milan lagged behind as banks extended their losses in Italy. This as European finance ministers expressed concern about the new coalition government's budget proposal during their meeting in Brussels. The spending plans, which were outlined by Rome last week, foresee a budget deficit of 2.4%, far higher than the 1.6% previously targeted. The proposal also includes tax cuts, a basic income, and higher government spending. Italy already has the second highest debt to GDP ratio in the Eurozone after Greece, and the latest proposals appear to break EU rules. Take a listen.
The Italian government seems to privilege public expenditure. Public spending can make people popular in the short term, as it can cause slight gains in growth or in the political sphere. But in the end, and we have to tell the truth to the Italians, who is paying?
There's a new face at the top of Instagram. The photo app's head of product, Adam Mosseri, will take over effective immediately after co-founders Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger abruptly resigned last week. They reportedly quit about 6 years after selling their social network to Facebook for $1 billion over growing frustrations with Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook shares down about 1.5% on that announcement that we've just gotten in the last hour or so, Laura. Lots of questions about the future of this social network. Will it follow the path of Facebook more? Facebook, of course, its owner. Will it continue to be a separate entity? All these questions for the new CEO to take a
trouble brewing for the tech titans there. All right, Kate, thank you very much indeed. Kate Moody there with the business. We're going to